All right, what's up, everyone? This is Detroit Gamesters, episode one. Well, technically episode three, but it's been a while since we were last doing this. So, a little bit of background information. My name is Shamir, and I've been a gamer my whole life. Really into anime, do some fiction writing on the side. Really interested in mental health, and that's my day job. But as I've gotten older, I've wanted to kind of, spend more time talking about games, talking about the things that motivate me, inspire me. And I found myself hitting up my buddy a lot on the phone and chatting. And we thought, why don't we try and make this a little bit more professional and, just throw it up online. So that's why we decided to put this together.
Yeah, and similar to my buddy Shamir, I've loved gaming since I was a child, very sentimental to it. And, I just think it's about time we start talking about it in a space that we can get a lot more conversations going. And I feel like it's a great time more than ever to talk about it because it's so important in modern society. So,
Yeah, and I feel like, growing up, we had like our crew of gamers. We grew up on, Halo, Call of Duty, all those shooters, 360, PS3. And then as we've gotten older, a lot of the people that we used to play with are too busy, working or with family or this or that. But, we still find some time to game here and there. And if we're not gaming, we're at least keeping up with news. So, yeah, and, seeing that this is the end of 2024, we thought it would be good to start off by just talking about what games we've been playing this year, what games we're excited about, what's going on in the news place, and yeah, what we're excited for. So yeah, maybe I'll turn it over to Arjun. So tell me, when you look back at 2024, what gaming stories or games really, really grabbed your attention?
yeah, it's been a kind of an exciting year. I'll say that for sure. I mean, it's one of those years where it took me a while to get back into gaming. I'm always on and off. There's always an ebbs and flows for me in my life because I have a full-time job as an engineer. But honestly, like one of the games I got into this year was Hi-Fi Rush and Borderlands 3, two, one being very old and one being very unique for the Microsoft platform. And honestly, as everyone has heard about, the studio getting shuttered down and then getting some life and getting resuscitated back to life there. So, it's really interesting because I used to be an Xbox fanboy for so long, and then things changed. The way Microsoft decided to kind of approach their gaming strategy, and I think Hi-Fi Rush is such a great game. It's so artistic. It's so creative. It was made by a very small team. It's not very long at all. It's not very hard, but there's enough packed in there where when they shadow dropped this game, everyone was quite surprised, and I didn't have a whole lot of faith at Microsoft at the time because a lot of the games that I cared about, like Halo and Gears, really weren't coming out anymore. And I know I kind of sound like the typical hypocritical Xbox fanboy because those are the games that were coming out in the initial years of the Xbox One, and then I said I want something new, and then as soon as something new came out, I was like, I don't want this.
Yeah, I didn't play it for the longest time until I had to harass you to play it.
So that game was great. Honestly, I beat it in a pretty short period. It was on my mind. It hooked me really quickly. I love the game mechanics. I love that there was some depth to the story, but it wasn't so complex.
I feel like that depth really like grabbed me. Like, spoiler alert, the game has been out for Game Pass for such a long time. So if you haven't played it, then really you should go play it. Like, what's your excuse? But no, I was surprised like near the end of the story, like when Chai, the main character, has to, kind of. I remember there was that scene where there was like that force field, and you actually
Yeah.
have to be really introspective. And I was like, whoa, like what is this? Like, there's a whole character arc and everything.
Yeah.
I thought it was just like your typical like idiotic like male stereotypical figure that you see in Family Guy and American Dad and everything, but there was actually a nice character arc that I did not expect that
Yeah,
at
and
all.
they even address it later towards the end of the game, where when you talk to one of the other characters, they say, "Chai, you've grown up. Like you've really
Yeah.
changed," and that's over a span of maybe 7 hours, and it feels so quick, but it's like it feels like it's earned.
Yeah, and it actually felt like even though probably in game world like not that much time had elapsed, but it's a sign of a good story where you feel like it's been a journey. Right? I
Yeah,
don't think it's been a hero's journey. Like these guys have been beating up these robots forever,
right.
and by the end of it, like it felt cathartic, like it felt earned, and it's been a while since I've played it, so I don't remember the final boss, but I remember there were some really good boss fights in that game.
Yeah, the boss fights were kind of off the chart, and I feel like this is one of those games that are perfect for like a boss rush mode. And they
I
had some
think they
unique.
actually just made. Well, I don't know if it was a boss rush mode, but I know they added some DLC stuff. Like it was
Yeah, they
free
did.
updates and stuff.
Yeah, and they definitely had some of those modes where you could like um, try to quickly finish levels, get higher scores, better performances on your like the combats and stuff like that. Very similar to like what they did with Final Fantasy 16 and Devil May Cry, where you're trying to earn a better score. And I feel like a lot of games are also doing this for the streaming
Oh yeah.
like
Oh yeah.
era now. Like everyone loves to watch games on Twitch, wherever, and they're like, yeah, I want to see how do you add replayability into these games, and I feel like they did it.
But it's nice that they were able to make that work because I feel like this is the type of game I would play on my 360, right?
Yes,
Like in a
100%.
modern age, but they were able to still have those modern sensibilities like that work for the streaming age.
Yeah,
So it was kind of like a nice blend. Like even and now that I think about it, like the gameplay wasn't this like crazy frenetic action at first, but then as you got more and more into it, then that craziness came in, then like that layer to the combat came in, and so you got a little bit of the best of the both worlds. Because I feel like nowadays games are so hectic and there's so much to learn, and you know and you really have to be very good at gaming to do good in modern
yeah,
games, right?
yeah.
But Hi-Fi Rush to me seemed both approachable but also complex.
Yes, exactly. There, like it was easy to get into, and it could be as easy or as complex as you wanted it to be. And that's why I want to talk a little bit more about the studio too. I think it was a disservice that like I'm sure Microsoft had to go through a lot to figure out who they wanted to cut, who they wanted to lay off, and if they wanted to go piecemeal by going to every studio and saying you're going to lose a percentage here, or you just shutter down one studio. And obviously, everyone is kind of going through tough times, especially with software companies in general. But it's just sad because this was such a divergence from the games they typically
Yeah.
created at Tango Games Work with all these horror games. And to see this and to kind of branch out, like I kind of look at this as I look at Pentiment, right?
Yeah.
That studio saying, here's a small set of resources. I want you to go off and do your own
Yeah,
thing.
well, I feel like, and I know we've talked about this before, but when you look at all of Microsoft's studios, right? Like some of those studios, you would think maybe they would have canceled them by now, like when it comes to State of Decay or
Mm,
Hellblade or things like that. But I think a lot of these studios actually have multiple projects cooking. So when I first heard the news about Hi-Fi Rush, it just made no sense to me at all, right? But now that I think about it, I feel like they did the calculation on how much more profit they could make from Hi-Fi
yeah.
Rush 2, the game development time. They felt like that wasn't worth the investment.
Right.
They didn't have other projects that were on the back burner that were maybe halfway through because they just released their other games like Ghostwire Tokyo and things like that. They probably looked at how popular Evil Within it is and Ghostwire Tokyo is, and then they're like, you know what? It's not going to be worth the investment. While some of these other studios, and I know we've talked about Hellblade and before and how we feel about it, but they got some other stuff cooking, right? So
Yeah.
then if those games are halfway into the development, then it might not be as worthwhile to cut the studio. So I
Yeah.
think as an outside as a gamer, when we see some of these decisions that Sony or Microsoft or other people make, it's really hard for us to fathom it. But we have to keep in mind that they know about their secret projects. They know about how far
Yeah.
along
There's a
those
lot of
are in
factors at
development
play.
too, right? It just sucks as a gamer because it's so rare, just across all of media, whether it's books, TVs, movies, whatever. It's so rare to get something that's new and fresh and it lands,
Yeah.
because everything feels like repeated or recycled, right? And Hi-Fi
Yeah.
Rush, even it felt like a worthy spiritual successor, right? As opposed to just recycled content.
Exactly right. Like you said, it's fresh, it was new, and part of that comes back to Microsoft's strategy. And not to go off too much on a tangent, but the fact that they're already behind Sony and obviously even Nintendo in terms of brand IP, everything that they have, it's more of they can't take as many risks and they can't
Yeah.
take that many more chances. But they have been very open and free with a lot of their developers in-house studios. So it's not like they haven't went to some other studios and say, go ahead and try and make your own thing. Obviously, what was the game ever? What was it, Everwild or
Are you talking about Rare with
a
Everwild?
Rare?
Yeah.
And they're still giving them opportunities to like do
Yeah.
their thing without shuttering them. It's just that at the end of the day, bottom line is like you have to be able to make money from these projects
Yeah.
eventually. And this wasn't a game that was greenlit with a sequel in mind either. They
Yeah.
just started contemplating it after the game was released, and it would still take years to create. So that's just way too long. The juice probably isn't worth the squeeze.
But I think it's like a testament to how much people love that game because I remember when that game came out in 2023, I was like, man, people are not giving this game the respect it deserves. And people aren't talking about this as much. I feel like it's just the Xbox fanboys who are talking about it and everyone's shooting them down online. But clearly, it was a very loved game. If out of all of the IP that was canceled and forgotten,
Yeah.
someone swooped in to save this one, right?
Yes.
And I think I even read an article somewhere where the company that bought the team, they don't actually think Hi-Fi Rush 2 is going to be financially viable, but they were like, this is too good of a gem for us to let it die, right? Which goes to show you that, sometimes what you see in the internet isn't always reflected across,
100%.
Especially other studios and other developers, because we don't know what people in the industry are thinking of their peers, right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely the case. I just think that, like, again, I don't want to say it's a shame, but it was probably a very tough decision.
I think as an Xbox fanboy, like that's one thing that really made me lose my steam this year. Like when I go into, when I reflect back, I started off with the original Xbox, and then 360 was my next one, and then I only switched over to PlayStation when Killzone came out.
Right.
So I've always had Xbox like dear to my heart, and we've all been through as Xbox fanboys in the last couple of generations. But this year in particular just left me with so many mixed feelings because I'm oddly optimistic and nihilistic about the future, right? Because I feel like my identity as an Xbox console owner has dramatically changed, right? We don't have, Xbox console exclusives are gone forever, right? The console wars are pretty much dead. I'm not trying to be hyperbolic when I say it. It's just because the three have decided to be in different lanes, right? They're competing in different ways now, not the way they used to, right? And especially the news of, Hi-Fi Rush and that studio, when we finally had something where I was like, finally, Microsoft is proving themselves, it just leaves like a bitter taste in your mouth, even though there's so much to look forward to in 2025.
Well, to kind of put it a little more into perspective, when some of these consoles that came out that were at their peak of like popularity, we were at an age in our teenage years where we said, okay, we loved what they launched with, which was like Halo, which was like shooter games, maybe some RPGs and some things that were kind of all over the place. We've now grown up to a point where we can't play games that are 20, 30, 40, 50 hours all the time. So like you said, what we like changes along with every generation that comes in. I don't want a constant bombardment of The Last of Us 25 hours. I got to call a PlayStation all the time. You make bloated games. I'm sorry, but I was happy with the fact that I could play a game so quickly,
just blast through
it and get in so quickly just as well. And that's what grabbed my attention. And that's why I want to go back to this game specifically, is that not only from a mechanics and an artistic perspective, they did great with the music selection, with the art direction. They did great with like just overall trying to think about how they can encapsulate one full story and end it within that full game.
Yeah, you don't have to worry about like DLC, right? Like it was a cathartic ending. You got an ending. You don't have to worry about, oh my God, what's going to happen next?
Exactly.
Right? If there's room for it to tell another story, but it did what it needed to do in the span of one game. And I remember, like, I still remember how hyped I was, and I messaged you as soon as I got to that part in the game when they had the Prodigy playing, and then you go out to fight all those robots, samurais, and they're like in chef's gear. I mean, that's just so creative. Like, oh man, that was like chef's kiss. That was so good.
It was good.
So now, I know you haven't been able to play everything in 2023, and we were supposed to talk about 2024, but we're talking about leftover 2023 games. How high do you rank Hi-Fi Rush in your 2023 list?
I mean, honestly, pretty high. If I had to like actually give it a score without thinking a little too much about it, maybe like an 8.5. And for me, that's pretty high.
Would you say it's like top 3 out of what you played in 2023?
I would say it's like top 5 for sure. And again, in 2023, I played maybe I beat a total of maybe 7 games. So the sample size is very small for me. But it's definitely up there. It's not something that I would actually go back and play it, especially portably, which is what I did. So I have the ROG Ally X, and I ended up using Game Pass, the cloud version of the app on it. And honestly, it was super smooth. I couldn't really feel the latency, couldn't feel the lag. And playing it portably was just a different experience. I could lay in my bed on my couch. I could have a podcast on. And that honestly is so transformative. Like I say it, but you have to really feel it.
Handheld gaming is the truth, man. And I know I was debating between the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. I know you have everything, but I only have the ROG Ally. And the ability to play Game Pass on that was a game changer for me. And even just streaming off your Xbox, the latency is pretty good. Like compared to when I was trying to stream off of the PS Plus apps and because I don't have the portal, that wasn't as good. But the Xbox connection was flawless. I remember playing all of Jedi Survivor, and it was almost as good as playing on my TV.
Yeah, and so they even have options now that if you do the cloud version of streaming, let's say like on ROG Ally, they have options to reduce the latency based on the hardware you have. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's getting better and better. They keep improving that technology. And so maybe I'll pivot here. the game that I've been playing right now and that finally has its hooks into me is Borderlands 3. And again, playing that portably is so much different. When I tried to play that through a console, I could no longer get into Borderlands. It was a game that I loved growing up. It was one of my favorite franchises. The humor was hilarious. The writing was peak, I thought, at the time. And it really resonated with me at an earlier age. Borderlands 3, I just couldn't really get to it, playing it on a TV anymore. But when I played it portably, it meant something different because, again, I was able to kind of focus my attention or multitask quite a bit. And I'll be honest with you, Borderlands 3's writing is not so good.
Yeah.
Mechanically, again, very, very sharp, very on point. But its storytelling, its main protagonists and antagonists are just not there as it used to be. So the fact that I can watch a football game, the fact that I can listen to a podcast in the background and really just churn out the side quests, because this is still that atypical kind of, hey, you have to hit these side quests before you can progress to the next phase and the next phase. So I'm starting to finally like it, but I would have not liked it if I wasn't able to play it.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how that is? I got Prince of Persia when it was on sale for the PS5, and it was like $25, and I totally regret not getting it for my Nintendo Switch because if I got it for the Switch, I would have beat it by now.
Yeah.
But it's just something different about when you're plugged in on a console, like it demands your full attention. And if you have other people in the household as well, it's like you're separating yourself from everything around you. And I feel like that's why mobile gaming is on the rise so much. And you look at Japan, you look at China, you look at all these places, like people just, it's harder for them to find that time and that energy and that commitment to really to sit down with like a game and a TV and just, isolate themselves. Now, I think, don't get me wrong, I'm not like one of the crazy people who are saying, oh, console gaming is gone forever. There is always going to be a place for that. There is always going to be people who want to separate themselves and really just invest into the best graphics, the best experience on a massive screen. Just like there's always going to be people who go to a movie theater. Whether or not it's as successful as it used to be is another question. But I love movie theaters. I'm always going to go, even if it's 2060, right? And so, but it's nice having that, variety. It's nice having those options. And some games really are just way better playing mobile.
So let's talk about that a little more. Because I am actually really fascinated by that. In the previous console generation, PS4 and Xbox One, everyone said there's no longer going to be a next generation, right? Everyone thought that we peaked out at all the gains we were going to get from a console, and that the next generation really made no sense. And guess what? Lo and behold, we got a PS5 and a Series X. But talking about portable gaming now in CES 2025, apparently they're going to release the Steam or unveil the Steam OS versions or licensed out to third-party vendors for hardware. And now there's talks about having Steam OS on the Legion Go. Okay, there's a specific version of that hardware that's going to be released.
That's going to be so good. That's going to be so good.
I know, and it's crazy because the Steam OS.
You think it's going to come to ROG Ally too?
I think so. I think there's going to be a point. And I think now that Microsoft is investing in a potential handheld, they've already basically said they're years away.
They said that's the future. They want to move away from console.
Exactly. And they're now saying, well, we might also want to make a portable, lightweight version of it for third-party vendors as well. So I don't want to say that we're not going to be having any more console generations. I think there will be a couple more, but I think, like you said, portable gaming is on the rise. And
the thing is, Microsoft's pivoting. Like that's one thing about Microsoft is they're, as much as everyone hates on them, right? Microsoft is really good at analyzing trends and predicting where the market's going to be.
Sometimes a little too early.
Too early. That's what I was going to say. Like Xbox One failed because of DRM in part, right? And Connect and all of that stuff, right? But everyone buys games digitally now. Yeah. So many people I know only buy games digitally. We still buy the hard copies, right? We still, go sell them. We sell the discs and stuff. But a lot of people I know just buy it digitally. And Microsoft saw that coming, right? Yeah. They saw the transition to mobile. They saw the transition to cloud gaming. They saw people not wanting to be limited on the devices. I think Game Pass is going to work out for them eventually, right? So. And so they see these things. They see where the trend is going. But a lot of times they're too early, right? They don't do it properly, right? And for a lot of time, it's kind of like the difference in Microsoft and Apple, right? Like Microsoft is really big on being there first.
Yeah.
AI, whatever it is, Microsoft is usually trying to jump on things very early. And if it doesn't work out, they cut their losses.
Yeah, they cut their losses. Like, there's been talks, and I'm sure there's already some games that already do this, but in-game ads in video games, I think there's some examples already, but Microsoft has been pushing that front, and they really want to get into there. And then
that's going to be a huge revenue source. I mean, it's annoying, right? But for certain games, like for free to play shooters and things like that. I
Yeah.
can totally see that be a huge income source.
Yeah, but so like that being one, and then like you said, kind of looking at portable gaming in general, what worries me the most about this, I think, is that the pivot going back. So I think what Valve did with the Steam Deck, right,
Yeah.
which was great, that brought a lot of popularity, and then Nintendo really hitting the mark with
Yeah.
the Switch. They had that half baked idea with the Wii U, and it fell flat. And then they said, "Here's
Yeah.
the Switch. We're gone all the way. We're consolidating our resources from our portable gaming sector, which was the DS and the GBA, and we're taking stuff that we had with the Wii. We combine all those resources so we focus on one platform." And what worries me now is that PlayStation potentially might want to do another portable
Yeah, they're
handheld
totally
gaming
going to
device.
do it.
But the thing is, how do you then consolidate all your resources? You either have to make games that are very scalable, which could take a lot more effort, especially from first parties, when we already know that games take 5 to 7 years to create.
Yeah.
For example, they just announced Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet, which has been in development for 4 years, but there's no release date.
Yeah.
And this is what's frustrating because Nintendo is so good at this. They constantly take, and I've actually been analyzing this over the last several weeks. They take all their old franchises that they've been releasing since GBA, like Mario and Luigi RPGs, and every 3 to 5 years, they're always on point. They release a new sequel, a new Zelda, a new Mario Kart game, a new
It's just
Mario
business
Party game.
as usual. They know what the people want, and they deliver it. So I guess two things that I thought about. I think for any successful business strategy, you need to know your audience, right? And that's what I think made all of these so successful. Nintendo knows their audience. They know exactly what the Nintendo fanboy wants, and they constantly deliver it. And that way you build momentum, you don't lose momentum. And to me, the reason why Steam is so successful, even though I'm not a huge PC gamer, I've PC gamed enough to know how frustrating Windows can be.
Yeah.
And just simplifying and unifying everything in a storefront like Steam that's reliable, that's what that audience wants.
Yeah.
And the sales and all those things, they know that audience. So, I think if I'm pivoting back a bit with Microsoft, their struggle is going to be knowing their audience because they're constantly trying to change their audience and grow their audience, right? And their true audience is their hardcore gamer core, right? But they're straddling this line between keeping them happy enough, but also pivoting to new audience members. And so that's going to be their challenge. And with PlayStation, you brought a really good message, a point. It's really going to be their development cycle, right? And we'll see what happens, but I think what you're going to see is probably pivots to more double A. You're not going to be able to have all these triple A's, and I think Sony's probably realizing that as well. They're probably trying to get branch out and get funding in other places, whether that's making movies, TV shows, making taking over Elden Ring and making it a Netflix hit, and then finding these double A successful hits, and then with the AAA successful hits, they have so much brand recognition. I think it's still going to take a very long time for those to come out, and it's unfortunate side effect of their business strategy. I don't see that speeding up. Unless AI can just revolutionize everything, I still see all of these major studios taking 5-6 years to develop stuff. And it's hard because if they make a secondary studio so they can have two things cooking at the same time, like Insomniac, how are we guaranteed knowing that they're going to be of the same quality?
Exactly.
Right? And so then you run into that problem as well. I think in terms of scalability, I think I could totally be wrong. This is total speculation here, but I think about how how little has changed between the generations, and I think it's because in a way technology is kind of peaking, right? And if you think about the PS6, right? Let's say it shoots for 8K or something like that. There's still going to be people using a 1080p console,
That's
right?
true.
As long as they don't screw up like the Series S did with having different amounts of RAMs. I think it wouldn't be as hard as we might think to have scalable operations. Like Series S, really, if they had 2 extra gigabytes of RAM, I think it really would have helped the scalability between the S and X line. I mean, I'm not an engineer. You'll probably know better than me. But I feel like from what I've seen on YouTube and stuff, that was one of the major hindrances.
Yeah.
And I think Sony is a little wiser than that. And so if they were to do something, they would probably find a way of having different SKUs. Or they can just go the whole PS Vita route as well. I don't think they would do that, especially if Nintendo's pivoted away from it.
Yeah.
But you never know.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting because with Nintendo, they always talk about Shigeru Miyamoto. Everyone says we're more about innovating and being creative in this space rather than pushing technologically what we can
Yeah.
do. And their IP really fits it. So they make very, I hate to say it's very cartoonish types of
Yeah.
games, very kid-friendly games like a Mario, a Kirby, a Kid Icarus, that you're not making it super realistic.
Yeah.
So no matter whatever generation comes out, it can look like potentially a 16-bit game. It can look like a 2D HD game,
Yeah.
and it still invokes all these emotions from people.
Yeah.
And I also want to go back to like what Square Enix is doing recently with Dragon Quest, the 2D HD remakes of Dragon Quest 3, 2, and 1, and how people now want a Final Fantasy 1 through 6 remake in the 2D HD style rather than remaking it in this full-blown HD style like Rebirth and Final Fantasy 7 remake, because A, it takes forever to get out, and B, it becomes so bloated. And I know you played Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth and beaten it.
Yeah.
And
I have thoughts about that.
There's sections of that game that are so bloated that if maybe you played it as a 2D HD remake, you would be cutting through a lot of that instead of walking around in these barren spaces. Yeah. So I do think that's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years. But this is why I'm excited for Nintendo. I used to be so excited for hardware launches. I'm no longer excited for hardware launches. I'm excited for games. Yeah. So whatever a new game comes out for the next generation, I know Nintendo's going to push the limit to what they can do on the next system. Yeah. I don't care that the hardware looks slightly different, that there's stupid Joy-Cons, and that they're infrared sensors. I don't care about any of that anymore. And that's what's changed my opinion on gaming in general.
Well, I feel like with Nintendo, the sum is greater than, the parts, right? Yeah. When you look at the technical specs of the Nintendo Switch, it's not that much. But when you look at how much Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom were able to accomplish, it's amazing, right? Yeah. And that's because for them, like, it's a tool, right? Like, they really do see, like, just like someone would see a pencil or a paint or anything like that. That's how they see their consoles. And that's the creativity behind it and why people love it. And going back to what I'm saying, it's about knowing your audience, right? And, maybe this is going to sound kind of philosophical, but, I think about why nostalgia works, right? And I feel like for all of us, there's certain things we want to get out of a gameplay experience or a story, right? Like hero's journey, want to see the hero win at the end, right? Or we just want something like a cathartic release. We had a stressful day. We just need to get some anger out or some energy out or whatever, right? Or we want that adrenaline rush, And for every generation, there's going to be certain things from that generation that allows them to have that outlet. And that's going to be what follows them, Like anytime I know that I need to get that adrenaline up and I need to play something, right? I'm going to play shooter. That was my generation. We hop on Halo, we hop on Call of Duty, we hop on, those type of things. But you see like the newer generation, right? And I feel like those adrenaline rushing games might be different, right? It might be action adventures, like you see so many of the Souls-like and things like that. Yeah. And that's why, to me, I think it's smart to use both nostalgia and innovation like what Nintendo does. Yeah. Because they know that audience that loves 2D platformers, they're not gone, right? Yeah. And even if they haven't gamed in 10, 15 years, there's something primal that you're tapping into. And if you just invoke that same format, you can bring that back up, right? Those memories. Yeah. And those people are going to convince younger people to play. Yeah, right? Exactly. And that's how Nintendo just works so well with having Tears of the Kingdoms and that Echoes game. What was that?
Yeah, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom.
Yeah, that came out, right? It's both nostalgia and innovation.
Yeah, and I find this more funnier because like I see a space carved out for Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo to all coexist within the current industry. Some people say, well, Microsoft's going the route of Sega. They're no longer going to make hardware. They're going to just become a publisher and then release all their games on every possible platform or as much as they can, like PlayStation, because a lot of fans are potentially upset that now their games are coming out to PS5 or whatever. But, I see a space for all of them. I think Microsoft will continue to do what it's doing, but they're all about choice, consumer choice, making sure everyone's happy in the ecosystem, but that they are not limited. With Sony, with someone that's maybe potentially in first place, they say, we're going to limit you because we want you to keep coming back and buying our products. Yeah. And then with Nintendo, they say, we don't want to compete with any of you. We just want to coexist with our IPs because we feel like there's that niche, that specific genre that has unlimited potential that can yet to be tapped by anyone else but us.
Yeah, I feel like Nintendo wants to be the lifelong friend. Yeah. Sony wants to be the premier, like, HBO experience, like as smooth and fancy as can be, right? And Microsoft just wants to know a little bit about everything. They just want to be involved in every part of everybody's lives.
Yeah, I definitely see it that way. It's interesting. I'm more excited than ever to see where some of this is going. And that's why, again, I'm starting to to get back into gaming a lot more, and I think Borderlands 3 is a great way to kind of get me into what I used to love as a kid. And I kind of want to take a look at a couple of other things, because now that I'm talking about Borderlands 3, obviously the TGAs, the Game Awards, happened recently, and there's quite a few games announced. This is probably like one of the best TGAs as of the
Hands
last
down,
several
yeah,
years.
best one.
And one of the games announced there was Borderlands 4. Like, we had known it was coming, we hadn't seen anything about it, and there were some teases in the summer, but really it was about Mafia and from 2K, so everyone kind of got a little disappointed. And then the Borderlands movie came out and it was trash. But seeing Borderlands 4, it kind of hits the spot where the way they edited the trailer, it's just like there was some things about it I didn't like the main characters again and whatnot kind of look a little silly. But overall, I'm kind of psyched. And
But they knew their audience. They know what
Yeah.
they want. Like, I think the cel shaded graphics looked amazing. You know, it was high energy enough. Like,
Yeah.
they know what the people wanted and they delivered.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what it is. They hit on all the points that like make it really nostalgic. So that, plus there's a couple of other game announcements I'm going to really rattle down quickly, and then ask Shamir kind of like his thoughts on some of them, on the ones that I'll highlight. So there was the new Witcher game, Witcher 4, essentially, that was with some text really at the bottom saying running pre-rendered on an unannounced RTX GPU, which was probably the 5000 series. Really interesting for them to put it when it was pre-rendered. They didn't really have to do that, but okay. A new Elden Ring game called Elden Ring Night Rain, a PvE spinoff. They had Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophet by Naughty Dog, which they had some funny teas in there to first announce The Last of Us 2 remastered for PC. That was really funny. Mafia: The Old Country, which I think is interesting that 2K is about to release 3 bangers all in the same year with GTA 6, Mafia, and Borderlands. So, you know, that's really interesting to see that this is probably their most profitable year ever, fiscal year. Then you get a Okami sequel by Hideki Kamiya, coming back to reform the Clover studio that once was there that made those games. Onimusha coming back. Then you have Project Sentry by RGG, Ryuga Gotogo, who've made all the Like a Dragon games, as well as they're making Virtua Fighter now, Split Fiction, and then the Outer Worlds too. So
Yeah.
if you want to talk about any of those.
Well, a couple thoughts. So some of those games really are going to get a lot of people hyped, but you know, I didn't really play them growing up, like Onimusha, right? But I think for the industry as a whole, like, take note at what Japan is doing. Take note at what Capcom is doing, and
Resurgence.
you know, they are finding a way of taking their old IP and still making it work for modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
They're bringing things back, and it doesn't feel like it's in a way. I mean, it's kind of forced, but it doesn't feel super artificial.
It doesn't.
It's actually like bringing up hype. It doesn't feel like we're beating a dead horse,
Yes.
right?
They're not setting these high expectations.
And I feel like with other franchises, and you know, I can't go a whole podcast with talking about Halo because Halo is my favorite game of all time, you know, but I will admit that, you know, in some ways it feels like we're beating a dead horse. It's not dead. I played a lot of Infinite, so don't get mad at me. So I think I played like 200-300 hours, so I'm a big fanboy. But I can sense the general feeling that people have. But that's why you got to space things out. You know, Gears of War had enough time on the back burner that look at how much people are excited for, you know, the new Gears of War. So I think, like, as an industry trend, like, look at what Japan is doing and look at how they're able to bring their IP back successfully, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's amazing. In terms of what really caught me at the show, you know me, Halo is by far my favorite game, but Witcher is very close up there. I never thought I would like a game as much as I liked Halo, and Witcher was, so close.
Okay.
Absolutely fell in love with Witcher 3, and you know, I've debated on whether or not I'm going to finally get a desktop PC, because right now I have my old Razer Blade from like 5 years ago, and the battery's probably going to explode at some point. But after I saw that Witcher 3 trailer, I just found myself getting so hyped, and I was like, oh man, I want to play this in amazing graphics. Maybe I got to try and get that new 5000 series when it comes out. So by far and away, I'm excited for Witcher. I'm not a huge fan of the massive backlash that, you know, I've seen online in some forums and some places when it comes to what Siri looks like and this and that. I mean, I'll admit, when I first saw that trailer in 1080p and, you know, bitrate wasn't great, I did feel like she looked kind of strange. But after I rewatched the trailer in high fidelity, it looks like a next generation version.
You had a lot of people commenting on her actual human and physical anatomy, and I don't see anything wrong with this. This person looks great, looks like an actual woman,
a female human
beautiful
being.
Yeah, I'm right? Like, what is wrong with people?
And again, like, I can kind of sense, because I did feel like kind of an uncanny feeling when I first saw the trailer, but I think it was because it was low bit rate. When I watched it in a good bit rate, I was like, oh, this looks terrific.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And the story is about Ciri. Like if you're a Witcher fanboy, you
You would
know that
know.
it's about Geralt. But man, so much of the book, so the
Yeah,
games, it's all tied into the story of Ciri
and
and why
they
she's special.
and why they kind of close off Geralt's story by the end of Witcher 3. So if you haven't really played
Yeah,
it, then you wouldn't know.
yeah.
But like this is the lead up to the next
So
story,
if
the next
you
arc.
did another Geralt story, it would just feel like you're beating a dead
Yeah,
horse. So
and
you
they
have to go
and
somewhere new.
and CDPR already has said that Garrett's going to be in the game somehow in some way. So
Yeah,
whether he's like training, helping, mastering, mentoring, whatever, he's going to be there. They're not going to just throw him off
yeah.
the ship. You
And
know, he's going
his,
to be
I'm
there.
pretty sure his voice was in the trailer too.
Yes,
So,
his
and I
voice
think that
was
was
at
to
the end.
remind us that hey, I'm still around.
Exactly.
So to what I love to play another game with Geralt. Absolutely, I love Geralt. He's one of my favorite video game characters of all time. But at the same time, I recognize that for the writers of the story, eventually you want to do something new, right? Like you don't want to have to keep writing the same story 100 times. You want to find new ground while respecting
Yeah.
what is your story roots and why people came to your story in the first
Yeah,
place, right?
exactly.
And I'm sure from a writer perspective, they're going to be far more excited to see, okay, what's the perspective of Ciri after all of the events of Witcher 3, where she was such an important person. I'm thinking this is after Witcher 3.
Yes,
But
this is definitely
they've
after Witcher
confirmed that,
3.
yeah. And I feel like that's an interesting place to build the story, right? And knowing the Witcher series, I'm sure we're going to get to play as Geralt, because Witcher 3, you got to play as both.
Yeah.
So that's what I would anticipate.
That's what I would too. Maybe some random scene or a thing drawn out where he's at a bar drinking and for some reason people attack him and that's like a 5 minutes thing. Sure, why not?
So by far and away, that's what I'm the most hyped for. Second, and I know this is kind of a contentious topic right now, but I'm excited for Intergalactic. Because I know some people might hate me for it, but I have to give it to Naughty Dog. They really do come up with unique universes and unique ideas, right? And after there's been so many stories told in the science fiction space and in the fantasy space, it's hard to come up with new stories. And I mean, the one disappointment I personally had was, man, we got to stop making 80s in everything. Like 80s is always a thing in everything. And it's like, if you're trying to find a new aesthetic, why are we always just remixing the 80s?
Well, let's not take out of context. They said their inspiration for the game was Akira and Cowboy Bebop. And you have the red jacket, obviously.
Yeah. So after I saw that, I was like, all right, I'll see, but that was one thing I was like, okay, this did kind of remind me of Guardians of the Galaxy and Concord. So I do feel like they could have tried to differentiate the art style a little bit because, I know the whole art style of the game is unique. You see those robots on the end and you know that it's unique. Yeah. But again,
I'll give you that.
You're typing into something nostalgic. As soon as you see those colors, as soon as you see those brands, you're tapping into a whole reservoir of people's memories. And the first thing they're going to think is Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. Guardians was the second thing that was on my mind. The first thing that was on my mind was Concord, which was an utter failure. And I'm just like, I thought this game was over. Yeah. There's no way they're resurrecting this.
It's like, come on, if this is a trailer you made, like you could have been a little bit more thoughtful of your brand placement, your color selection, just a little bit more, because now you're walking up a mountain, you're walking up a hill. You didn't need to have that, right? Because you could have chosen, what imagery you evoked, right? So that was one thing, but. And when I saw that, I mean, I know people are always giving Neil Druckmann a lot of hate, but as someone who's an aspiring writer myself, I was like, man, I wish I could come up with this many like fantastical worlds, right? And they're all pretty different, right? You look at Last of Us, you look at Uncharted, you look at this, like it's amazing how different all of those IPs can look, even though they have the same trends. I mean, and even when you look at other studios, what other studio is going from Crash Bandicoot, right, all the way over to Intergalactic.
Yeah, this is a very big change. They've already announced that this is going to be their deepest, most intricate game ever. So probably in terms of combat and based on the ideas we saw at the end of the trailer. So I'm excited about that. Yeah. I'm not really hyped about what the story could be because it's taking place on potential one planet. I also don't
know that.
Yeah, that plus the likeliness of the in-game characters to the actors. I find that really kind of unsettling.
Are they the same person?
Yeah, so they're so Kumail Nanjiani's face is there. You got Lalo Salamanca from...
Man, that's the future though. That's the future.
But I liked, honestly, I'm not gonna lie, when I played Last of Us Part 1, I like that the characters don't look like the voice actors. I feel like that little campiness, that little, like the way
it's the just, uncanny valley.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll see how this comes out, but I know these actors so well from so many other movies and shows that I don't know if I'll be able to bring that out now, because You got Kumail, who was in a Marvel movie. You got this girl that was
I
in
mean, I gotta
Sabrina.
give Kamal some love, bro.
You
I
got
love that guy
you,
from Silicon Valley.
you got this girl that's now the main protagonist that was in Sabrina, the Netflix remake, and I can't get that shit out of my
Well,
head.
that's what we're. I guess that's the trend of what we're talking about. These deep primitive things that are embedded in people's head, right?
Yeah,
Like you can't unshake that. You can't change that, right? You have to be conscious of that, and because that's a part of knowing your audience,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like when you have those actors pop up, your audience is going to remember certain things about them, right?
Yeah,
And as a good writer and a good producer of a fictional piece of work, that's something you have to keep in mind, right?
yeah.
Doesn't mean it's always a negative thing or a positive thing. It's something you should be aware of.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think what's going to be now really interesting is Troy Baker basically said as much that he will be in Naughty Dog's next game. So will it be his likeliness finally for
Oh
once?
well, that will be something.
That'll be very interesting to see.
And I guess one other thing I have to talk about, kind of elephant in the room, and maybe another contentious topic is all the vitriol and all of the backlash you're seeing online
Yeah.
about the gender and how there's a certain type of agenda that people are pushing in their narratives and things like that. And that's actually makes me think of the game I wanted to talk about today, which is Dragon Age, right?
Mm.
And especially after playing Dragon Age, I think what really struck out to me is, if there's any place where you're going to try and push an agenda, it's going to be in literature. It's going to
Yeah.
be in fiction, right? So this is a story as old as time, right? When you look at past generations, past civilizations, people use fictional stories as a way to tell things about their lives, to show people other perspectives, right? And to change society. And if you think about it, like a lot of the biggest changes in society coincided, right, with fictional pieces that made people think about things different, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, or all the stories we heard about slavery and prohibition and all of those type of things. So to me, if it might get annoying for some people, but in when it comes to media and fiction and entertainment, this is what you should anticipate. Sorry about that. We're back. So as I was saying, in fiction, that's where you're going to see people trying to push an agenda, and it might be annoying for some people, but it comes with the territory, right? And for me, the power of a story is the fact that you allow someone to hop into someone's perspective, right? And if you're trying to change people's perspective, you should know your audience, and you should know that these are people who are going to have resistance to being forced in someone else's perspective. So if you're going to do that, if that's what your agenda is, you got to bring your A game. You got to make sure that whatever you're telling is so good that even if the person is against this or doesn't want to see it through that perspective, it builds empathy, right? And now
Yeah.
pivoting back to Dragon Age, that's one of the things that really struck out to me because, there's a lot of backlash about the one character Tosh finding the gender identity and things like that. And to me, the reason that struck out to me so much is because the writing was so poor. And with Dragon Age across the board, there's parts where there's actually pretty good writing, and other parts where the writing is absolute trash. And it's the worst writing I've ever seen. And that's why I think you're seeing such disparate reviews where a lot of critics are saying, wow, this writing is actually pretty good and these characters are lifelike. And people online on Reddit are like, what are you smoking? This is like 2 year olds talking to each other. This is so artificial.
Right.
And I spent a lot of time really digging in and analyzing what went wrong, right? And so when you start off the game, I feel like one thing that Dragon Age does terribly is exposition, right? A lot of times the characters will repeat back what someone just said. They'll be like, all right, we're going to these runes. And then the next thing you see, the other character is saying, oh, yeah, we're going to the runes to do this. And it's like, no one's going to talk like that.
Yeah.
And as soon as you do that, it's jarring. You automatically break the fictional landscape, right? And the character interactions too, it does really feel like there's HR department that's watching. And because people don't get angry at each other, there's no tension. And tension is always very important when you're writing a story. When you take that tension out of these characters' interactions, it deflates the world, it deflates the stakes, and then you're really wondering, why am I spending my time here? Because everything is happy land, right? And it makes it feel artificial. So it's like the writers for Dragon Age spent so much time spent creating these. And I know you haven't got to play, the game, but they have each character has its own character arc, and in a way, they're like different games because they have their own antagonists, they have their conclusion, all these type of things, right? So they spend so much time making you fall in love with these characters or care about these characters. But every time there's a moment of terrible writing that just pulls you out of the game, it reminds you that this is not a real place. These are not real people, right? And so that's why it's so jarring. And so the reason I brought that up while I'm talking about, if you're trying to have an agenda in your story, for that character Tosh, it just felt so out of place because in one moment I'm talking about the world falling apart, right? And the next moment, this character is getting mad at someone because they're wearing a dress, and then suddenly pivots into I'm struggling with my own identity, which seems out of place for the context of everything that's going on around these characters. So instantly that seems fake and artificial. And then right after, like, later in the story, you say the most generic line to this character, and suddenly they're able to solve the crises that they have with their gender identity. So if the gender identity is so problematic that you have to focus on it before you can save the world, but at the same time, I can solve your issues with 5 words that anybody can say, and that so automatically that's bad writing, right? And then I get what the writers maybe were trying to do, where a lot of times you try and put yourself in that character's shoes, right? And you might even bring your own real world experiences to make it feel real. But you got to realize it's fantasy world. The rules of the modern world that we live in do not always apply to a fantasy world. I think that's something I picked up from one of Brandon Sanderson's podcasts. So you have to tailor what you're going to write to that fantasy world. And that's why I felt like that writing was so artificial. It fell flat. And that's why, again, if you're going to try and push an agenda, I'm not saying it's right or wrong to do that, or I don't agree with it or not. I'm not trying to get into political things here. But if that's what you're trying to do, bring your end game, right? And so I say that because I think right now, because people have had these experiences with other forms of media where they've been seeing stories that are trying to, change their viewpoint or their perspective, and some of them really just weren't told well. Now there's that automatic nocebo effect. There's that automatic filter where they see something like that, they're like, no, don't do this because you're just going to ruin the story, and they just automatically expect that if there's some agenda being pushed, it's at the expense of the writing quality, right? And so again, knowing your audience, that's something that Naughty Dog knows it's going to be up against. So I do hope that whatever they're trying to do, even if they're trying to do something, I don't know if they are. I mean, you know how the internet is, and they see a woman with a bald head and they start freaking out. Maybe there is no agenda there, right? But if Naughty Dog is trying to show a certain type of perspective, right, then you got to bring your good writers.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, honestly, I didn't realize how passionate you would have been about this specific game in Dragon Age Veilguard, because I think you did play Inquisition. I think you made a beat in it at around the time I beat it, maybe potentially 10 years ago. And it wasn't that decisive for you, but like from a narrative perspective, I think it hit a lot of different tones for you. You being a writer, you can kind of see how it helps you formulate different stories. And I think like BioWare being known for like that deep narrative storytelling, it's like, well, what could have gone so wrong with this because of how decisive?
I'm so happy you brought that out, because for me, and again, I think I might get some flack for this, but I've always considered Dragon Age as bigger tier fantasy for me. And I'm not saying Dragon Age is terrible, right? It's just for me, things like The Witcher resonate with me so much. Lord of the Rings resonates with me so much. Some of Brandon Sanderson's works resonates with me so much. Dragon Age hasn't always resonated with me on that same level, right? And I think a part of it is because each of the games is trying to create its own identity, and there's specific things that follow through. But Dragon Age Origins is very different than 2, which is very different than 3, which is very different than 4, right? Now I will say with this new game, the reason why, and again, might come as a surprise, but it's one of my favorite games of the entire year, is what they really nailed is the setting. And I feel like Dragon Age has been building to a lot of world-changing events, right? And this game really had a lot of things that impacted the world. Even when you think about the history and the lore, we learned so much about the history and the lore of Thetis that my mind was blown. I was like, this is such fascinating stuff, right? And so I know that when I've written stories, sometimes I feel like in the back pocket I got these, awesome, bullets that are coming, because I got some amazing scenes coming, I got some amazing twists and information, right? And I feel like with the newest game, there were some big reveals on how the world works in Dragon Age. And so because of the strength of those reveals, kind of ballooned up the overall game for me, right? And it's almost like saying they had so much good stuff in their back pocket cooking that regardless of how much they screwed up on Dragon Age, it was still going to come out as an
Right.
okay game. So that's why it's a game I have such conflicted feelings about, because when I think about the setting, when I think about the changes to the lore, right? When I do think about looking at all of the characters as a whole and how fleshed out their stories are, pretty good writing,
Right.
right? But when I think about the character interactions and things like that, and how fake it can seem and sometimes forced, and how artificial the communication can seem because there's no tension there and no one gets mad at each other, then I'm just like, what happened
Yeah.
there? And I think, again, going back to knowing your audience, for me, I was able to go into Dragon Age knowing why people hated it and seeing it more as an action game,
Yeah.
right? And so for me, because it didn't have all those RPG elements, but I was okay with that,
Yeah.
because I saw it more like an action game, just like Final Fantasy 16.
Right.
I was okay with it. But if you go in there and you're expecting Baldur's Gate 3, right?
Yeah.
Then you're going to be so angry. You're going to say this is the most trash game ever.
Right. Exactly. It all depends on your expectations. And, I'm kind of curious now of your thoughts. I have two questions for you, really, based on kind of what you've seen and now knowing that BioWare isn't putting any more resources to Dragon Age. They're not making any DLC and expansions. Do you have any hope and faith for the next Mass Effect game?
Oh,
I'm
absolutely.
sure there's going to be parallels there. And two, do you think this should have been nominated for anything at the TGAs?
I think so. I mean, I think I'm still debating on what my favorite game of the year is, but Dragon Age is up there. Right now, I'm debating between Dragon Age and Black Myth Wukong. I think for me, this was a slow year. There wasn't a lot of options. I've just gone into Indiana Jones, and I'm really liking it. It might get in the top three too, probably will, but really, it's a hard choice for me between Black Myth Wukong and Dragon Age. Um, Probably I'll give it to Black Myth Wukong overall. So because of that, objectively, I think it's a pretty good game. In terms of what it could have been nominated for, this year had good RPGs. If you have Metaphor ReFantasia and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that makes it hard for Dragon Age to do very well, right? Because there's huge fan bases, right?
Yeah.
For Atlas and for Square Enix. And Bioware fans have been so burned that a lot of them have left, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what makes it hard from that perspective. Now, in terms of expectations for Mass Effect, to me, the biggest problem with Dragon Age was the inconsistency, right? I know there's good people who work there, right? Because I can tell based off of some of the things they've done, right? And how they've built up the lore and things like that in Dragon Age, that for Mass Effect, I would be excited to see what they do. And I would be excited for another Dragon Age game. But you got to make sure your consistency is there from the top. And one thing I don't think people talk about enough for Dragon Age, it's actually a very polished game. Like in 2024, there's not a lot of games that come out that polished, but I played the whole game and barely had any bugs, barely had any frame. I mean, I had some frame drops, but it was understandable because there was so much going on in screen.
Yeah.
So I think BioWare is still a very capable studio, right? But they just got to work on their consistency.
Yeah, and I think what I have some faith in, and again, I haven't really played the game itself that much, but I've seen a lot of the gameplay. I think combat-wise for the next Mass Effect game, it's going to be there. They even had it for Mass Effect.
Man, the combat was so good.
Yeah.
Like I sorry to cut you off, but this is what I've been meaning to tell you for a while, and I wanted to tell you on the podcast. But playing Dragon Age made me really think of Destiny because,
Right.
like in Destiny, I remember I would grind for hours with side stories that had no content at all for like little fragments of stuff that would make my gear just a little better. And in Dragon Age, you're constantly getting pretty significant improvements to your gear. You can actually build quite a lot of different classes, and even though they're fairly similar, if I switch one weapon for the other, I can actually see a noticeable difference. It's each side mission you do almost always ends up with a unique piece of armor or an upgrade for something you already have. So from that perspective, like this is the first time in a long time that I've been addicted to the loot grind, and I've actually been addicted to leveling things up. And so for me now, when it comes to Mass Effect, I think they're going to nail the action.
Yeah.
I think they're going to nail the loot and things like that. Because they'll probably expand on what they have.
Exactly. I think again, the thing that people like the most, in my opinion, and I don't want to generalize for everyone, is for Mass Effect Andromeda. I think the combat was great. I know a lot of my friends have talked about that. I think they're going to have very deep RPG mechanics in the new Mass Effect game. And I think if they can bring back old characters, they really, like you said, have to just nail the writing. And are
Yeah.
they setting the game up for a trilogy, a sequel?
No.
They didn't do that for Dragon Age. They didn't have that intention. They really wanted to get that out of the picture because it was building upon an existing world. But with Mass Effect, now that you're almost soft rebooting it in a
Yeah.
sense, do you set it up for further sequels?
And I think what BioWare really needs to figure out for their next game is, as a studio, and this sounds so cliche to talk about goals and like what are you at your core, but BioWare really needs to ask themselves, are you an RPG studio?
Yes.
And that sounds
What
like a
is your
strange,
identity right
that's
now?
it's your identity. It sounds like a strange thing to say, but they've drifted in so many ways and it feels like they've experimented. Like in a way it feels more like, we don't think about this as much, but Japanese like RPGs don't normally have as much choice and consequence as Western RPGs.
Yeah.
And yet we give Western RPGs so much crap when they don't have the same choice and
Exactly.
consequence because it's audience expectations. And Bioware has toyed with that too much. And so now they really need to define their identity. Do they want to be your standard Western RPG that has a lot of choice and consequence and all of those type of things? Or are they trying to be more like an action adventure like Black Myth Wukong? Are they trying to be more like a JRPG? Like what is their
Yeah,
identity?
I think there's some ambivalence there from the studio because I'm sure a lot of people already know this, and for those that don't, a lot of the ex BioWare leads that worked on Anthem and the old Mass Effect games have all left, and they've all started their own studios now. They're working on these like I think it's called Exodus. A lot of the ex BioWare leads are working on stuff like that. So they're no longer the same studio they once were 10 and 15 and 20 years ago. So you're right. There's, I think, a little ambivalence, and I think their games are going to continue to evolve. And I actually think there's going to be very heavy on the action portion of it. And I think Mass Effect will still have that old essence, but any new IP they make going forward, I don't think will be like that anymore.
Yeah.
And who knows if the studio will even exist within another 5 or 10 years.
You know, I don't mean it as like a negative thing, like we're doomsayers because BioWare doesn't really want to make RPG games. Like, I personally didn't really like Baldur's Gate 3 because it was too hardcore of an RPG for me. I played it, I had a good time with it, but it was too much for me to invest in how that whole system worked, right? And after Baldur's Gate 3 really proved this is how you do an RPG, right? We can debate all day long on how good of a game it was, but when you look at what its genre is and what an RPG means, Baldur's Gate set, the bar, right? And so if you want to invest and you want to be an RPG, that's the bar, right? Is it worth it for BioWare to try and do that? Or are they going to pivot?
So it's interesting you say that now because now that the bar has been set so high in 2024 and 2023, and you look at now, again, what it comes down to is making money. So Baldur's Gate made a ton of money,
Yeah.
right? An insane amount of money. And as of right now, we don't have a whole lot of indication, but Dragon Age isn't selling well.
Yeah.
So do they have to change and pivot to something and lean in more to the action?
And that's not necessarily a bad thing because look, I mean, some people might really love Baldur's Gate and they want to play Baldur's Gate until they die. But I think variety is the spice of life. I am totally fine with a game that doesn't have to be a hardcore RPG as long as you're telling me that's what it is, right? Because if I want that, I am going to go to Larian Studios. But if I want a different experience, I will go to a different studio, right? I think they complement each other. They don't have to substitute each other, right? And so for me, if BioWare decides not to really be a big RPG house and they decide to be more action adventure, not really lean into the choice and consequence, maybe they'll even just make one ending, right? There's just one way that things play out. I'm okay with it. Just tell me up front this is what I'm getting, and I think then you won't have as much backlash. People won't freak out. And since we're talking about RPGs, I feel like that's what the team at Avowed has done well. The internet has talked so much about what they thought was going to go on with Avowed, right? And I think they did kind of screw up with their original trailer, and they showed us a vision, and they were doing something different. And guess what? That happens when you're making something,
fair,
right? It's a part of the creative process, right? But ever since that first trailer, every time they showed Avowed or they talked about Avowed, they've tried their best to be very clear about what they're doing. Can you imagine if Avowed came out and they never commented on the fact that there's no romances? Then if people played the game and they couldn't romance people, they would lose their mind, right? They would be so upset. But now that we know there's no romances, that's not their goal. That's not their intention.
Yeah, or the fact that the original trailer kind of showed off a more dark and gritty world, and now it seems a little more colorful and palette, and it's just a little different. And it's like, okay, well,
there was an adjustment period because again, you sold someone certain pictures and ideas, and now you have to pivot somewhere else. People are going to have to react to that. They're going to
Yeah.
have emotions that come
And you
up.
got to have answers for it too.
Yeah.
If you want the game to be successful, right?
So
You don't
really,
want to
like
be
good
surprised.
communication, and I feel like that's why other games like Helldivers, Baldur's Gate, that's why the community likes them so much, because you have good communication.
Yeah.
And if you actually look back at most of the games that have not been successful in the last 5 years, I bet that a lot of those games just really had bad communication. I mean, some of them were just probably terribly made, like the King Kong game.
Yeah.
But other ones that really flopped, or we expected to do good and they didn't do good, it's because they didn't really properly convey what they were
Yeah.
about, or they were just not complete.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I don't. Sometimes you want more of the same. When I have, like, as an example, a Gears of War game that's coming out every 2 years, I want a little more of the same. But when I go with a break of a 5 to 10 year gap, and I go, I want this franchise to reinvent itself a little bit, I'm okay with it being a different game. I'm okay with Gears becoming a slightly more semi-open world game. It was going down that route, and it could add a little more variety, like you said.
Yeah.
But when you're like, so you got to kind of sometimes pick and choose what you want, and you got to listen to your audience,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's nice when the development process is very collaborative, when you're not so secretive about it. The one thing I get upset about is, yes, when a game is announced 4 years in advance, and I look at Witcher 4 and we know that game is far away, but they're doing it on purpose because they want their audience, they want their shareholders to be excited, and maybe they'll take some of that feedback and the lessons learned from what was the game that they just created? Cyberpunk, as well, and take all it together and say, we'll be slightly more collaborative and give people what they want.
Think about these other games like Baldur's Gate. They had an early access for so long.
That's true.
Sea of Thieves basically released as an early access, and everyone hated it, but now people love it, right? Because they listened and they did what the community wanted. Cyberpunk, right? Everyone hated Cyberpunk, and now it's like people have forgotten how pissed off they were about Cyberpunk. Why? Because they gave us an anime we loved, and they fixed their game, and they gave us what we wanted in the game. So now we're happy. So it's about communication. It's about knowing what that audience member wants, what your audience wants, and giving it to them, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
And now slightly pivoting a bit, because one of the things I wanted to talk about is the games I played in 2024 and I really enjoyed. And I know we've been talking quite a lot about RPGs. So I have to, of course, talk about my experience with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth.
Oh, man.
Now,
Let me take a little swig of this before I hear that.
Yeah. So I'd say I'm a pretty decent gamer. I probably get through at least 5-6 games a year, if not more. Last year, I pretty much got through at least 8 or 10 games. So I do game a decent amount. But for a long time, I kind of pivoted away from gaming because it was really hard for me to get through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And I was so excited going into the game. And especially after I read all of the reviews and how glowing they were. And then when I actually played the game, I was like, man, how are people not complaining about the pacing of this game? How are people not going on and on about how bloated it is?
Well, let's talk about the first just a second. I don't want to interrupt you here, but you've now said both Final Fantasy Rebirth and Final Fantasy 16, which are games that maybe vary between 30 to 80 hours. But you were able to get through so quickly. Dragon Age, which was like 60 games. So talk about a little bit the differences that allowed you to like focus and hone in more on Dragon Age and what like Final Fantasy could do better going forward.
So the reason I felt like it was way easier for me to get through Dragon Age is because there wasn't as much resistance to things being accomplished, So for instance, in Dragon Age, each of the missions are pretty short, pretty focused. Like, for instance, if a mission starts in Dragon Age, a lot of times it's like, okay, we have to go meet this person, and he's going to join your team, and he's going to be your new party member, and then you're going to fight out of some dungeon. That's a pretty standard, format for the level, right? So I anticipate that going in. Well, in Dragon Age, sometimes I would meet that character immediately in a cutscene, right? Or I'd have to do a very short 5-minute something to get to that character. And then the story would progress, then the combat would progress. Now, the pacing and the level structure for Final Fantasy VII, it felt like I was actively working to actually get anything accomplished, because I can't really fast travel until I unlock these locations, and I have to really go through so much distance in order to get to the location, while probably finding a bunch of random enemies I've fought a million times, or I skip them, right? Then I can unlock a chocobo, which can let me go to places faster, but then I have to do a bunch of side quests to do that. So then that's a huge time suck, right? Then when I finally get to the point that I need to be at, I have to normally find some character in a town, which will take a while. Then I have to go through a bunch of cutscenes. Then finally, when the story starts progressing in that level, then I have to go to a different perspective of all the scenes of the event from a different character in the party, use their special abilities, and literally go through the entire level, but in a different part of the level until I reunite with my
So it's
teammate,
kind
and
of
then I have to fight a boss.
yeah.
And it's like, and then
They,
finally at the end, I get like a kernel of this story is moving forward. But it's like I just feel like I just ran a marathon to get there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because I remember playing Final Fantasy VII Remake back during the pandemic, and there were so many moments where you're like in some factory, you're with one person, and I'm getting to point A. Then it pivots to the other group who's not with you, and they're purposely separated.
Yeah.
And then you get there, and then it's the boss battle. And it's like, why did I
And
waste
some of
7 hours?
the separations are so artificial. Like I have literally seen Cloud jump around like he is a god.
Yeah.
And for some reason, he cannot meet up with everybody else because he can't jump over a few rocks. Like I've literally seen him do this in cutscenes throughout the whole game, and he can't just jump over some rocks.
And that's
And
why
I have to pull something in order to climb up. I'm like, bro, we can just jump.
and that's why, like in Final Fantasy, at least with 7, it's so video gamey. And by that I mean they hold you down, and they're like, hey, this is just part of a video game. It's like, no, you don't have to do that.
You don't fool yourself into believing that this is the real world. Like you know you're playing a video game when you're playing Final Fantasy VII. And so for me, that's one thing that really just slowed the forward progression of Final Fantasy. Now, different people want different things, you know. For me, like Dragon Age gave me a lot of a dopamine rush, you know, like constantly things were happening. It was like boom, 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 boom. For some people, they might feel like that's chaotic, that's erratic, right? They want to kind of have a slow burn, right? And so then they might be turned off of that. As opposed to, you know, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, like what I'm describing as a negative, some people might love, you know, like they want to explore the unbeaten path. They want to talk to all these characters. They want to chase chickens and collect them in, in a random pen in order to progress the story forward, right? And that's because it helps them really fall into a fantasy land. And that's because we don't think about it as much, but each gamer comes to video games to get something different. Some people want that escapism. That's what they really, really like, right? They want a massive world that they can feel like they live in. For me, that's not why I game. Like I like that, but the main reason I game is because I want to see interesting characters do cool shit and a world that's interesting and different, right? I'm really narrative focused. I really want to look at the character arc. That's why when I normally play games, I don't play side quests because I'm like, why am I playing this optional content? Like, I want to see these characters change. I want to see these people grow. Like, why do I want to fall in love with the random person in a village? Like, I want to see my character change.
There's not that many games where a side quest will be so deep and impactful to the overall game. And I forgot what game I was just listening to, but there are like some game recently came out that was doing that. But yeah, it's just not that often. So you, like you said, I'd rather just skip through and mainline the whole game, and just not have to worry about this constant grind, which is a very typical thing of Final Fantasy games. You have to grind so much.
You have to really immerse yourself in that world. And another unpopular opinion, but my favorite Bethesda game is Starfield. And people hate Starfield. Why do I like Starfield? What other people saw as a con, I loved. Like, I love the fact that I can literally just open up a menu, even though it's a convoluted menu and it sucks, right? But I can just press a button and go exactly where I need to go. I don't want to wander around, and I don't want to find random stuff. I don't want to find a random cave and go in there and find some cool loot. Like, I just want to get there, you know? That's the type of gamer I am. That's why Starfield spoke to me. But other people obviously hated that, right? Because Bethesda's audience are not people who want to just get from point A to point B. Bethesda's audience wants to take the scenic route. They want to get lost. They want to explore.
I agree. Yes, the audience wants it, and that's the type of audience they have. But they also set expectations that this would be a deep space explorative game that you could do these things. In reality, when it was just fast traveling to point from point A to point B,
isn't that my point proven? It's because they didn't properly communicate what they are, right? Like, they sold people that this is even more expansive than every game that you want. They shouldn't have done that. They should have said, we're doing things differently. Exploration is going to be different in this game, and you shouldn't expect to find the same type of exploration 100%. And fun that you got in other games, right? you have 1,000 worlds, but really it's more for the visuals and the ambience. There's not going to be much to do on those worlds.
Exactly.
Right?
And what everyone thinks of this game is a very subpar game potentially. It's actually probably a very decent to good game.
I mean, if you look at OpenCritic, like in Metacritic, it's in the mid 80s. Like people act like a game that's in the mid 80s is trash, but a lot of games are 8s. You know, we expect them to be 9s and 10s, but they're actually 8s. Like to me, Final Fantasy VII is an 8. You know, I like the game. I can trash on the game all hour, and you might think I hate the game, but I really like the game, right? And I give it an 8. But nowadays, an 8 just doesn't feel like it's good enough.
Yeah, that's the thing. And don't forget, I mean, I'm just going to say this: IGN gave Dragon Age Veilguard a 9, but that has the lowest scores on it.
Yeah. And you know, I think the Metacritic on that's an 80. So you know, IGN was an outlier. And it's interesting, like with Dragon Age, I agree with so much of the IGN review, but also so much of what I read on Reddit. That's why I think Dragon Age is one of the few games where like all of these opinions have some truth to it. The people who really liked it, the reasons they liked it, I get it. The people who think it's the worst RPG ever made, I totally get it. I can't disagree with either camp. You know,
it's interesting.
It's about what you want out of a game, right?
Which is why, like, it's more like, you know, you can listen to so many reviews as a game comes out, but like at the end of the day, you just have to play it. If there's enough that speaks to you, regardless of the score, either you pay with your wallet and you say, I'm going to try it out, or wait till it goes on sale, or you don't play it at all.
Or you play it on Game Pass.
And it's hard for you to put your opinion out on a game you haven't played. You know, I feel like there's a lot of people out there that will say that a game sucks or is really good. It's like an echo chamber. Yeah, it's like an echo chamber. And it's like there's Nintendo games that always get the brownie points because they just say it's Mario, it's Zelda. Yeah. It's like, have you played the game? Yeah. It might not be as good as you think, or maybe vice versa.
So I'm happy you brought that up because to me, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is not a 92 or a 93. Like I think objectively, the pacing is terrible on that game. It's so bloated, right? And because it's the second part of a trilogy, it's not very cathartic. Like you don't feel like Hi-Fi Rush ended, you felt like it ended. In Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, from the beginning to the game to the end of the game,
so it feels like nothing really happened.
How much has really happened?
Yeah,
you know,
not much.
Because this is only going to be the Act 2 of 3 in the original game, and I'm just like, all right, like I've put in 100 hours. Right. Can we start moving?
Yeah, like I don't know if it was a mistake to split this game in 3 parts, and I understand why because the scope is so big. But to know that there's no definitive ending every game, and then to open up even broader, because again, spoiler alerts, there's some multiverse, parallel universe type shit in this game. It just makes it that much more complex.
I mean, in hindsight, I think monetarily, it's probably going to work out for them. I know there's been some reports that maybe it didn't sell as well as they expected.
But you reuse the same platform and you just crank it out. Sure, you'll make your money.
But to me, if again, since we're talking RPGs, I have to take about Baldur's Gate 3. If people are playing Baldur's Gate 3 for hundreds of hours, right? You know, you can't tell me that, we couldn't make all of Final Fantasy VII remake work in 100%. One game, because we have games that are 100 to 200 hours.
Exactly. And there's so much bloat, especially in Rebirth. Like so many side quests that you just don't need to do. They didn't need a packet with 30 to 40 hours worth of side quests. It was just fetch quests. Like you really don't need that.
Yeah, and even the original structure of the game, like, look, I know there's people who love Final Fantasy VII, right? But the original structure of the game, like, to me, that's not the type of narrative I like. I don't like narratives where basically the party knows that they have to end up at point B and they're going from point A to point B, but then they have to pass through like 10 lands on the way, and in each land something new happened. Some people really love that. One Piece. People love One Piece. What is the general premise? We're just getting the One Piece. Yeah. But they go to so many different places. They experience so many different stories. It's the journey, is the story, right? That's not me. Like, I want a very focused story, right? And different lanes.
And maybe a conclusive ending.
Yeah. So that's why with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, when I was playing it, I was like, oh, great, we're going to this land just for this character's backstory. Oh, now we're going to this land just for this character's backstory.
And on top of all that, when the game was releasing, now it's probably in a much better shape now on the PS5 Pro, but we can't ignore the fact that from a fidelity perspective,
Yeah.
it does look like garbage. Like,
Yeah.
I hate the fact that that was something ignored and it got a 92 on OpenCritic.
Oh yeah, but now all of a sudden, like the PS5 Pro version is coming out. You're like, oh my god, this is so
Yeah.
good. What were we looking at before? I'm like, no, it's because you're biased.
You're
Like,
biased.
you weren't actually telling the truth. You weren't being objective.
Yeah.
You just love Final Fantasy, so you're talking about it. And look, I love Final Fantasy. Crisis Core is one of my favorite games of all time, right? Even though I never played the original Final Fantasy VII, like the themes, the imagery were so huge for anyone who grew up in the 90s. Like, we all knew about Final Fantasy VII,
Yeah.
even if we didn't play Final Fantasy, right? And it's impacted so much of my writing, even though I never played it, because so much of fiction in general borrows from Final Fantasy.
Yeah,
so
100%.
I absolutely know it's a legend and it's one of the greatest games that have ever come out. But if we're going to be objective about this review, and if your job is to be objective about it to help inform, monetary decisions and people buying it, then you got to be able to tell subjectively how you feel about it and objectively what the game is like.
Exactly. And you got to look at that on a holistic standpoint. And I just think that, like, where the game stands, I think it had a lot of issues graphically, and that should have been just noted a little higher in these reviews. And I hate to name drop people, but I always go back to this. Ryan McCaffrey from IGN with Halo Master Chief Collection, like, gave it a 9 when it released, and that was a horrible game at launch. And he even admitted himself, like, yeah, I was biased when I reviewed it, and I wish I could have reviewed it again.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to know when you're biased because we love things like, I love Halo. Like, I know I'm going to give Halo games a 10 out of 10 because I just love it so much, right? So that's why I try my best to say, okay, objectively, here's what I think is working and not working in the game. Is that a problem for you, right? Subjectively, I don't care. Like, that doesn't bother me at all. That's why I love the game.
So, well, at least, okay, so let me ask you this question. Because this game was a time exclusive on PlayStation, we now know it's coming on PC. Are you okay now with the fact that Astrobot won Game of the Year overall, and it being a Sony exclusive? What are your thoughts?
So for me, I bought Astrobot. I played it a little bit. I think in this year, Astrobot's the safe choice. It makes sense. I get why, it's the game of the year. But a platformer is never going to be my game of the year because I already said, like, for me, I'm about narratives. I'm about character arcs. I'm about character interactions, those type of things, right? Astrobot, a platformer is not going to have that, right? So it's just not something that interested me. Like, am I going to play Astrobot? Absolutely. Am I going to enjoy it? Absolutely. I'm having fun with it. But it's not what I think is the pinnacle of gaming because that's not what I look for in games, right? But that's a different opinion than a lot of gaming journalists and, the general media, right? Even gamers. And so it absolutely makes sense to me objectively why it's game of the year. Subjectively, I can never have a platformer be a game of the year. And I think that's how some people feel about racing games. They'll say racing games can't be game of the year because for them, what they look for in a gaming year by definition can't be in a racing game because it's a simulation, right? And they're like, no, like, when I play games, I'm looking for characters and narrator and narration, and this is a simulation.
Exactly, 100%. And like, it's hard for me to look at something like a Mario Kart or a Forza Horizon being game of the year, but for someone else saying this was the most deepest game I've ever played in a long time.
So that's why, like, and I picked this up on, from fiction writing, like, you got to know your genre and you have to grade it within that genre, right? And within the genre of a platformer, Astrobot does what a platformer is supposed to do very well.
Very well.
It excels. And so because of that, it deserves Game of the Year because it's in their genre. It does what it does incredibly well, right? And so that deserves awards.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And then again, I agree. It's the safe choice. I mean, I haven't even played Final Fantasy Rebirth, and just seeing gameplay videos of it, I would say I would pick Astrobot over it. It's just that's just where I'm at.
I mean, the gameplay was fun. Don't get me wrong. I had a great time fighting the enemies and everything, but yeah, it is. I think it took me 6 months to get through that game, and it took me 3 weeks to get through Dragon Age.
Yeah, that's insane.
Because for me to sit through 5 to 6 hours of Dragon Age was not that difficult, but for me, like, to get through 5 to 6 hours of Final Fantasy VII was so hard because I would play 6 hours and I'm still in the same chapter.
Imagine watching a 5-hour movie to be like, nothing happened.
And there's like one part in the game where you're literally a cat on top of
Yeah, like
something that I don't even know what kind of animal it is was a robot,
yeah,
and the gameplay was so slow,
yeah.
and it was like, oh my goodness,
Yeah,
can we
and
just
again,
move
and
forward?
I'm not going to say it's inexcusable. It's a creative choice to say we're going to put these sections, and they're almost making this game as if it was an old school RPG.
Yeah,
But I think this is the promise of Square Enix is that they have high expectations of their games. To go, hey, we made an 80-hour RPG, it should sell 10 million copies. You can't do that, but then put in these archaic mechanics and
yeah.
expect everyone's going to like it. Yes, I have to admit that we have smaller attention spans today
Oh
than we
yeah.
have ever had in
But you
in
have to
generations
factor in for that.
and
Like
decades.
people want these dopamine rushes, and like games like Final, like that old school gaming in the '90s and 2000s. You weren't constantly getting dopamine rushes
You're
the
right.
way you do in modern games, but you're selling to a modern audience,
Yeah.
right? So you have to find a way of either sticking with what you do really well, or finding a way of
Well, that's
being
why.
innovative. And I think that's partly why Final Fantasy VII Rebirth didn't sell well, because there's probably a lot of people who tried it and they're like, oh my goodness, this game is really slow. I'm not getting a dopamine rush.
Exactly. That's
And then they're
exactly
just
it.
going to go
And
back to playing Elden Ring.
yeah, and that's 100% it. And I honestly think they're kind of struggling now in some sense, Square Enix specifically, because their pivot to Final Fantasy 16 being more action oriented, I think was a good, maybe a safe choice to some degree based on market analysis saying, what do people like? But it was more like a 30, 35 hour game that says, hey, we're slightly more linear. We still have this grand story like a Game of Thrones type of style, storytelling, and maybe we see people getting into this a slightly more than we would on a Final Fantasy 7, where the story could be so convoluted, where it can maybe not make sense. But you also had similar struggles with 16, so which is why I think that game
Yeah.
also didn't perform
Well, I think
as well.
I mean, all right, maybe another unpopular opinion, and I have to kind of check my own bias because I know I come from a Western audience, and I know Japanese, just storytelling and difference is going to be different, right? So for me to come in with a Western lens and be like, oh, these Japanese stories suck, right? It's not really the right move because the whole way they tell stories might be fundamentally different, right? And so for a Japanese audience, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But I think Square Enix as a whole, like sometimes the writing is just not great. Like
Yeah.
when it comes to the villains in Final Fantasy 16, oh my goodness, like the second to last villain, I was like, this is the most cliche bad guy. He's just being bad to be bad. And it's like black and white, no gray. It's hard to believe that this could ever be a person who would become evil. It feels as video gaming can get. And for that game, it seemed odd to me because they were trying to kind of be like Game of Thrones, and they were trying to have these realistic characters in different nations who are kind of engaging with each other, and there's political backstabbing and all this type of stuff. So for me, I was like, okay, like this writing is kind of making me think is Japanese Game of Thrones. And then I have these like cliche video game characters, which are as cliche as it gets, and I'm like, man, what are they doing? And so I think as a whole, like Square Enix is so good with setting, with world building, with characters, right? Like protagonists. Like it's amazing how iconic the main characters and the parties are from Square Enix games, right? Their worlds are so fantastical, and they're so interesting. I get to ride around on a bird. That's such a cool idea, right? Um, but I think Square Enix might want to look into, hey, we're really trying to sell to a Western audience,
Yeah.
right? Maybe we should look at our writers, right?
I think that's a good point you made. And what was the game that came out prior to this from Square Enix? It was a very cliche written game about that African American girl that gets transported.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, it was Project Forspoken.
Forspoken. That the writing of that was horrible, and they actually had a lot of Western writers on that.
But my point being, what is Square Enix good at? The setting is interesting.
Yes.
The combat is interesting. The characters are unique and memorable. But the writing was trash.
It was trash. And so I think and the way I look at this too right now is like Capcom and all these other Japanese companies that are having a renaissance where they're coming back, they're bringing older games and they're pivoting forward and they're finding a modern approach now to it. And they need to really take a chapter out of those books and they have to really look at their competition and say, we have great IP, but what do we need to do? Because they're I think, so afraid to change the formula that they're like, if we change this now, it's never going to be what it once was. And I think they need to embrace that. I think it's okay that these games can be different.
Yeah.
I absolutely think
well, it's about evolution, like you have to think about how are you evolving, right? And look at Nintendo, right?
Yeah.
Like with Zelda, they know what's works with Zelda, and they knew what they could tinker with and what they shouldn't, and they knew what they should evolve.
Exactly.
Right?
They went from a
And
classic dungeon crawling game to an open world game. Like,
yeah.
who would have
Why
thought
is
that
that?
would have.
Because the core, they know the core of Zelda. They don't change that. But the things that need to be evolved and improved, they do it.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. I don't think Zelda is perfect because I think that combat system,
Yeah,
it's the same moves that you've been using for 20 years.
100%.
And so for people who are good at Zelda, they love it because they have that muscle memory.
Yeah.
But I'm like, man, it's literally the same swiping attack and the guard block
Yeah,
and everything that you've been doing for decades.
Exactly. So some things are still.
So there are some things that maybe you can evolve, right? But that's what you're gonna know. You have to know your games and your studio well enough to know, hey, this is what people like about us, and this is what we need to evolve and tinker with. And I think Square Enix also, if they're struggling, they need to really sit with themselves and figure that out.
Yeah, because the last thing that I want is a company that well established that has a legacy all of a sudden is just gone out of the gaming industry. So
I can't imagine like no Square Enix.
Oh my god!
I love Western RPGs, but there's just something so heroic and unique about those JRPGs. They just stick with.
Come on, Kingdom Hearts. This collaboration between JRPG and Disney characters, that was like my most fondest memory as a child.
And that's why I love anime. I love JRPGs and things like that because they're just unique. Like the things that they tinker with, the worlds that they describe, like they're just so different.
Yeah.
And it's not what you would expect. Because a lot of what we see in the West, a lot of it comes from fantasy roots that come from J.R.R. Tolkien. It comes from Christianity roots when you're talking about demons and things like that. And so over time, like it's kind of felt redundant and repetitive because a lot of those roots are all branching from the same thing.
100%.
And for Japan, I'm sure there's roots that are branching from the same stuff over there too. But because it's so different from what I'm used to, right? Like, it's just always interesting.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a fair point. So, honestly, like that's kind of a lot of what I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you wanted to get at?
Last thing I just want to talk about was just 2024 in review. I think to me, after we got off of the high of 2023, 2024 to me has been kind of a slower year.
Yeah.
My top standouts, I have been really liking Dragon Age. I love Black Myth Wukong. I thought some of the controls were clunky and it needed a little more polishing. But again, just getting immersed in Chinese mythology, it was so fascinating. And the gameplay was really fun too. So that was another top pick for me. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, in spite of me crapping on it so much, still really high up there because, man, the world is just so fascinating. Cloud is such an iconic character. Aerith is such an iconic character that just having all of that put together is going to get me hyped, right? So I still really like that game overall. And I think it's because these are things that I love so much that I get so passionate about because I want those studios and teams to just do better, right? Because that's what I love, right? It's like a love-hate relationship. We maybe for another time we'll talk about Hellblade because I think going into Hellblade, that was a game I had very high expectations for. I actually enjoyed the game overall, but it doesn't really feel good. I don't know if it's appropriate to call it a game because it felt more like a narrative experience,
like a simulator.
And it did not meet my expectations, but that was higher up there, but I maybe make it my fourth game. And then other than that, I'm just getting through Indiana Jones, and after that I'm gonna play some Warhammer.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair thing too. Same for me. I've gotten so many games in my backlog that I got, especially during Black Friday. I'm super excited to see what Xbox comes out first party wise and second party in 2025. We have a lot to look forward to in terms of Fable and Avowed and all these other games. And same with Nintendo launching new hardware. And I'm just super excited for the next Mario RPG or open world game and everything else they announced. So I'm more concerned about Sony as a whole. They're saying that they're going to have things starting in 2025 and every year after that, they're going to be releasing probably bangers, but I'm still not, I'm more concerned at the fact that they're not revealing a lot of information. We haven't had a showcase in years.
No.
And I'm more excited about actually Microsoft for once. So.
Right. Isn't that something? So I guess in closing, if we had to give a letter grade for 2023, what would you say?
2023 or 2024?
Sorry, 2024. 2023 is an A, so 2024.
Yeah, 2024, since we're not counting, let's say, backlog games and stuff, I would give it like a solid B.
Same. I'd give it a B.
The highs were high and the lows were kind of low, but they balance out.
For me, I'd probably be leaning more towards a B minus because Silent Hill is in my lane, Astrobot is in my lane. the new Zelda game wasn't my lane. So even though there was objectively good games, there just weren't the games that interested
That's
me
me
as much.
too.
So
Yeah,
probably I would look more towards a B minus, you know, potentially a C plus, but I'm actually really kind of liking Indiana Jones, so that's kind
that's
of
fair.
ballooning that up for me. All right,
All right, man.
and it's near the end of the year, so we kind of want to do a year in review, and maybe next time we'll talk about 2025 and what we are really looking forward to and how we think it's going to shake out.
Yeah, that's fair enough, man. So it's good talking to you.
All right, see ya.